it's not unusual to have a situation internationally where police arrest people and it later turns out that there's not enough evidence to link them to a crime or to ensure a conviction. So that is not unusual in and of itself. But I think in the South African situation, what we have seen over the last decade is despite big increases in the police budget, we have seen big reductions in their ability to solve crimes such as murder, robbery, and rape. So since 2012, the police's budget has increased by about 67%, but the ability to solve murder has dropped by 51%, and the ability to solve robberies has dropped by 30%. So we've seen a systemic reduction in the police ability to ensure that they can identify the correct suspects, arrest them, and make sure those cases go to court.
It often seems the arrests are made on circumstantial evidence with no concrete links, such as, for example, DNA.
It does, yes. It doesn't have to be DNA. There has to be a sworn affidavit or some evidence linking a suspect to a crime where the police are then entitled to make the arrest because they have some evidence that suggests that the person has committed a crime. But that shouldn't really happen at that point. Ideally, the police should do further investigations, and only when they're absolutely certain or close to certain that they have the right person should they arrest. But I think there's a lot of pressure on the police to be seen to be acting, to be seen to be doing something. And so too often you do see arrests being made prematurely before they have sufficient evidence, and then those cases don't go anywhere. So if you look at the total number of arrests the police make every year in South Africa, it's well over 1 million arrests. Sometimes it's as high as 1.5 million people arrested. But only about 260,000 cases are finalized in the courts. So there's a big gap between the numbers of arrests the police are making and the numbers of people who are actually going to court for certain crimes. And it's one of the big drivers of civil claims against the police, are unlawful arrests. In other words, police making arrests with absolutely no evidence against the suspect, the person they think has committed a crime, which in itself is unlawful. So there is a big problem there.
The suspects in the Krugersdorp case, for example, were identified by 3 of the victims in an identity parade. These were traumatized victims not long after their horrific ordeal. How useful is such a method in identifying suspects?
It's a very standard procedure in police agencies across the world because if you don't necessarily have DNA, the only evidence you might have is the victim saying, I say that person committed this crime against me. So that is a standard policing practice. But as you say, there are a whole lot of challenges there. A lot of research over the years shows that victims are sometimes, because of trauma, they think they remember people, and they point out the wrong suspect, so the person actually didn't commit the crime because of the trauma they're experiencing or because of a whole range of other reasons. So it's not a foolproof method, and there are a lot of problems with that kind of approach to crime detection.
Budgets are up, as you say, but so are serious crimes like murder and aggravated robbery. What explains that, do you think?
Well, we know since the National Development Plan was released and adopted by government in 2012, the fundamental challenge facing the South African Police Service is what the National Planning Commission then termed a serial crisis of top management. So despite the big budgetary increases, the turmoil at the top of the organization, the lieutenant generals who make up the board of commissioners, the highest decision-making body of the police, and the total cohort of about 170 generals has not been working in a coherent, strategic way to improve policing and reduce crime. We haven't actually seen since George Fivers in 1999 the National Commissioner of Police finish his or her term of office. Many have left under a cloud, have been recommended by boards of inquiries to be fired. We've seen a number of senior police officials, deputy national commissioners, provincial commissioners appearing in court for corruption and other crimes. The head of crime intelligence, Richard Nguli, is facing a second criminal case. So when you have people at the highest level of an organization, such as a police organization, who are involved in corruption and crime, it causes massive mistrust. And that organization cannot work coherently. And the mistrust and the infighting at the very top of the organization then filters down through the different components and divisions. And ultimately, it's the men and women in blue in the stations who suffer the most. They don't get the training they need. They don't get the support, the resources that they require, or the direction that they need to moving towards improving safety. And if they're involved in corruption or brutality or other misconduct, the systems to hold them accountable don't work. So then you have a situation in which we have large numbers of police officers. We've got almost 180,000 people in the South African Police Service. but they're not working in a coherent way. We're not seeing the kinds of gains and public safety improvements we should have, given that vast resource that we have called the South African Police Service. So at its fundamental root cause, it's a leadership issue.
You mentioned the pressure the men and women in blue are under to solve some of these crimes. The role of the police minister, we so often see Bheki at press conferences in front of flashing cameras, making promises. I mentioned several cases, right, from the Krugersdorp case to the tavern killings to the Kruger Park tourist. All of those he made pronouncements on, and almost all of them remain unsolved, and the wrong suspects were arrested. Is his role, is it helpful?
Well, the role of the minister in any democracy in terms of policing is not to direct the police to that level of detail. They should not be involved at all in operational decisions. They should not be saying we're going to make arrests, or we're not going to make arrests, or we're going to have task teams, or we're going to do X, Y, and Z. Those are decisions that have to be made by a highly skilled and trained police official who understands the resource base and the limitations of policing and what is possible. The role of the minister is really to do oversight. They must say the government of the day wants to reduce murder, it wants to reduce rape, it wants to reduce robberies and tackle organized crime. The role of the National Commissioner then is to make sure that they put in place the correct plans that are based on evidence, detailed analysis and assessments of the kind of who are the networks that are involved in these crimes, who are the individuals, how do they get their weapons, where they sell the goods, and then take those resources, the policing resources, in a targeted approach to make sure that they disrupt those networks and arrest people and bring them to court. And that minister's role is to ensure that that is happening effectively and to hold them accountable. So it's an oversight, executive oversight role. I think when the lines get blurred, then you start seeing a situation where the police are being pushed to do things for political purposes, which they might not be ready to do or able to do. And the ultimate consequence of that can be a decline in trust of the police.
And which they should not do. Let's get to the latest issue, the scramble now to respond to that US-issued terror alert. Are we up to dealing with this type of thing? There's also been a suggestion that, in fact, we were on the trail of the suspects and that alert has blown the investigation.
Well, this is one of those stories that is full of intrigue. We don't have all the details at the moment. We do have intelligence capability that do track people involved in international terrorism that have links across the continent and internationally. So it's difficult to know who's telling the truth and what's actually happening here. But certainly, I think this incident so far should lead to some serious introspection, not only from our own intelligence, but our ability for our country to have good, close, trusted relationships with partners who have intelligence capabilities, so that we don't cause unnecessary panic, so that there's clear protocols to deal with these things in such a way that, for example, if we are on the trail of these people, that announcement like this doesn't scupper that. So there needs to be much closer cooperation at that level. I think that's where the problem must be.
I don't know if you can speak on this, Gareth, but do you believe there could be sleeper cells operating within our borders, or at the very least networks posing as businesses but really raising money for nefarious activities? Is that something that you think is possible?
From what I understand, yes, that is possible. It does happen. South Africa is not seen as a target by these groups. It's more the country in which they can come to plan. They make use of our good communications, the banking systems. So whereas we're not really seen as a target because South Africa has not really involved, except for more recently in Cabo Delgado, the Mozambican situation, being seen as a target country. But these networks and criminal groups do operate in countries that are not targets for that very purpose. In other words, they have space to plan and do their planning.
With the launching pad, basically.
Yeah, but I do understand that our intelligence capability is fully aware of this, and it's not something that they're blind to.
All right, we'll have to leave it there because one of the difficulties, of course, is that you have to arrest these guys. You have to catch them doing something and not merely planning it like we saw with the Tulsi twins. Gareth Newham, as always, appreciate your time. The Head of Justice and Violence Prevention Program at the Institute for Security Studies.
Current events, developing stories,
tough questions.
Your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.